Hello, and welcome to the 2022-2023 opera season at Indiana University. My name's Molly, and tonight I'll be talking to you about the first opera of our season, Don Giovanni. As a historian, it's fascinating to me to think about the stories that persist through history, the ones we tell again and again, generation after generation. Stories of doomed love from Romeo and Juliet to Heathcliff and Catherine, stories of betrayal and revenge from Brutus and Caesar to the Count of Monte Cristo. Stories of heroes, villains, love, and loss. The stories we tell each other and the stories we tell ourselves can say so much about who we are. But who we are is not a monolith, and I'm convinced that these stories persist not because they mean the same thing to all of us, but because they can mean different things to different generations, different things to different people. Perhaps because of its problematic subject matter, remember that tonight you'll be confronted with deceit, betrayal, sexual predation, and murder. To me, Don Giovanni is one of the most potent examples of how fluid meaning and moral can be as these age-old tales wend their way through history. Some of you may know our villain better by another name, since Don Giovanni is of course the Italian face of the famous Spanish Don Juan. The one written of by Lord Byron and Baudelaire, the one tamed and vivified on the silver screen by Errol Flynn, the one Buddy Holly likens himself to in a hit single. If you haven't heard it, go listen to Modern Don Juan because it's a bop. The Don has become something of a pop culture hero, comic and titillating, at times even romantic. But when the story of Don Juan was first written in the early decades of the 17th century, it was a heinous tale of crime and consequence. According to experts on historical literature, the famed author of the Spanish Golden Age, Tirso de Molina, had a moralizing agenda when he set quill to paper to recount the medieval legend, to frighten frivolous young Catholics into a life of penitence and obedience to God. In de Molina's tale, the Don is a frivolous nobleman who wastes life away in sin and who is not given the opportunity for confession and redemption before justice is served to him, and he is dragged to hell by those he had wronged. For Molina's audience, Don Juan was a reminder that some sins cannot be forgiven, and that the fires of hell await those who turn their back on God. Fast forward to the 19th century and the age of the Romantics. To many of them, our villain was no villain at all, but rather a champion of freedom and individualism, a man who would rather be dragged to hell than to surrender to society's moral pressures. At that time, the Don was what we now call a Byronic hero, so called after Lord Byron, who often wrote of such characters, the Don included. Byronic heroes are defined by their brooding rebellion against the tyranny of conformity. These heroes are complicated, even wicked, yet challenge the insidious evils of society in fascinating ways. In 1813, Jane Austen herself wrote in a letter to a friend that she preferred the story of Don Juan to other tales of doomed men, claiming that she had never seen on stage, quote, a more interesting character than that compound of cruelty and lust. Fast forward another couple of hundred years, and imagine what a retelling of the Don's story would look like today. After the struggles of Me Too and a near global reckoning with the realities of sexual violence, it is women's voices audiences often long to hear in tales of seduction and deceit. In fact, one of the most successful recent retellings of the Don Giovanni story flips the script entirely. In it, the Italian poet and playwright Minotti Lero reimagines the Don as a woman, Donna Giovanna, a bisexual seductress who refuses to be trapped in a passionless marriage. Lero's play has seen several acclaimed productions since 2017, and critics have praised the new take on the Don Juan story as a welcome revision to the outdated and problematic historical tale. Keep your ears to the ground too, since there are plans to turn the story of Donna Giovanna into an opera as well. The point is, the Don Juan story can mean dramatically different things to different audiences through history. In a time when social order was held together by the rules of religion, Don Juan was made to be a warning against mortal sin. In a time of romantic individualism, he was made to be a symbol of nonconformity. And today, in a time of confrontation with gender and sexual politics, he is made to be a woman. But the opera you will see tonight comes to us from a different age, an age of so-called enlightenment, an age that saw the American and French revolutions and the birth of so many modern democracies. What did Don Giovanni mean to audiences of the late 18th century? What did he mean to our famed librettist, Lorenzo da Ponte? What did he mean to Mozart? Well, the story of Don Giovanni was told hundreds, if not thousands, of times in the 18th century. Under a slew of different names, the villainous cat appeared again and again on theater stages across Europe, each retelling an opportunity for alterations in the tale. Experts believe, based on a close reading of the libretto and his memoirs, that two of de Ponte's primary sources for his own libretto were a play version by the legendary 17th century French playwright Molière and a much more recent opera buffa version by the Venetian librettist Giovanni Bertatti. These two versions of the story could not be more different. Bertatti's text is often thought of today as a hollow shell of the work de Ponte and Mozart would make into a masterpiece. The one-act comedy was intended for performance between the acts of another opera, and so it was merely a brief comic interlude in a much larger affair. There was also less opportunity for character development, since several of the original actors performed multiple roles, meaning that some important characters could not interact on stage at the same time. So, for example, the actress who played Donna Anna in the original Venetian production also played one of the peasant girls that the Don would later woo. And since that actress was busy performing another role, the character of Donna Anna absconds to a nunnery early on, not to be seen again. This is quite different from the de Ponte version, where Donna Anna returns again and again throughout the story, pushing the plot forward and exploring a variety of compelling emotions. And so, without the time or the forces to offer the story any real complexity, many write Bertatti's libretto off as an unworthy precedent that de Ponte and Mozart salvaged from obscurity. In all honesty, de Ponte likely felt the same. For years, he actively suppressed the idea that his version of the story was based on Bertatti's, even though it's very likely that the commission for Don Giovanni came specifically as a request to expand Bertatti's libretto. In truth, Bertatti's one-act opera buffa was no flop. In fact, it was quite successful in its time, seeing dozens of performances in the decade following its premiere. Opera was not always meant to be an object of contemplation like it often is today. Especially for comic opera, it was often meant simply to entertain, and 18th century audiences found Bertatti's light affair plenty entertaining. This can be attested to by its many performances, and indeed by the very request that it be expanded. So just think about some of your favorite movies. I bet that there is a masterpiece or two in there, maybe a Bergman or a Tarantino or a Kubrick perhaps. But if you're anything like me, you probably also enjoy a silly comedy or two. Monty Python and the Holy Grail is one of my favorite movies of all time. Now, the Molière, that's another story altogether. It was composed in the 1660s, so only a few decades after de Molina's original, and even though it was a comedy, it was taken quite seriously in its own time. It was a controversial work, subjected to decades of censorship after being accused of undermining the authority of the French king. In Molière's version of the tale, the Don, a nobleman of great privilege, is not an unrepentant Catholic, but rather a free-thinking atheist who mocks the superstitions of the devout. In France, the authority of the king was built on the endorsement of the church, and so criticism of religion was usually interpreted as criticism of the crown as well. And so Molière's tale was controversial on two counts, mocking both the authority of the king and the moral standing of the nobility. Both of these were dangerous occupations in the 17th century. But perhaps they were more permissible at the end of the 18th century, in the age of enlightened revolution. Don Giovanni was not the first of Mozart and de Ponte's collaborations to be based on a controversial French play. Before Don Giovanni, the two had seen some success with another opera, The Marriage of Figaro. In fact, it was the success of Figaro that likely earned Mozart the commission to compose Don Giovanni. Figaro is based on a play by Pierre Beaumarchais that resounded with revolutionary sentiment. Filled with caricatures of aristocratic buffoonery and cruelty, Beaumarchais' Figaro was censored across Europe, even in Vienna, where the opera was premiered, for critiquing the ruling class. Figaro and Don Giovanni share an important theme then, the moral corruption of the rich and the powerful. Now, I can't say for certain what de Ponte's motivations were for choosing the Molière to be among his models, but I'd like to think that he had an eye for the politically provocative. For this, the Molière play fits the bill far better than the Bertatti libretto that de Ponte insisted he had no debt to. But while de Ponte may never have wanted to admit the importance of Bertatti's libretto to his own, the clash of political and moral depth with crowd-pleasing comedy is to me one of the most poignant elements of Don Giovanni. And it's an element that Mozart exploited to spectacular effect in his score. So I've talked for a while now about the story of Don Giovanni, but of course this is opera, and so much of what the story means is in the music, not the words. Tonight you will hear music seduce, you will hear it joke and lie, you will even hear divine judgment and the fires of hell. But how can music do all of that? Let us begin where our opera begins, with the overture. In most opera buffa overtures, you almost always begin in a major key. You move to a related but different key, sometimes minor, sometimes dominant, and then you return to major. This follows the trajectory of a typical story, right? The story begins, there is some kind of struggle or complication, and then there is a resolution that brings the story to a close, ideally with a happy ending. But Don Giovanni is not a typical story. Its beginning is marred with violence and deceit, and its ending, though fitting, can hardly be called happy. It is also fitting, then, if unconventional, that the overture begins in a darkly portentous manner. The haunting dirge you just heard that begins the overture would have been quite surprising to audiences at the time, expecting to hear a more typical opera buffa overture. Think about the famous opening of the Figaro overture. This was a masterpiece of the prevailing style at the time, as buoyant and playful as one might expect a comedy to be. But by flipping the convention and beginning with an ominous and brooding march, the overture not only depicts the arc of the story more accurately, it also beautifully captures the clash between darkness and levity in the tale. Compare the dirge of the Don Giovanni overture that you just heard with this passage from its middle section. That middle section sounds much more like the Figaro overture, doesn't it? But it feels different after our ears and hearts have been primed by that melancholy dirge. Now, how can music seduce? Of course it can be beautiful, but for Mozart, it's something more than that. Think about the famous La Ci darem la mano. I'll bet that if you have seen this opera before, it is this melody among all of the others that you left the theater humming.
La ci darem la mano, la mi dirai di sì. Vedi non è lontano, partiam ben mio da qui. Non vorrei, mi trema poco e cuore.
It's during this little duet that Don Giovanni attempts to gain the intimate permissions of the beautiful peasant girl Zerlina. And for a time, it works. Now, if it were only beauty required for seduction, the Don might have simply performed some vocal acrobatics to woo Zerlina. But it's not beauty that Zerlina needs, it is sincerity, and the Don, as we know, is a master of feigning sincerity. The melody he leads Zerlina in is almost saccharine in its simplicity, innocent, sweet, and repetitive. And yet, like all earworms, it is also insidious and penetrating, a way for the Don to work his way into Zerlina's confidence and eventually into her bed. Seduction of this sort is a wicked form of deceit which Mozart exploits musically to heighten the irony of the scene, since of course we in the audience know the true nature of our villain and can only look on in horror as Zerlina falls prey to the farce. But music can also lie to us. Whenever I teach this opera in the classroom, I love to talk about Don Giovanni's Act II serenade. At this point in the story, the Don attempts to woo Donna Elvira's handmaiden while disguised as his own valet, Leporello. He wields a mandolin, and for a moment, the music in the opera becomes diegetic, or in other words, the music now exists within the world of the opera. It can be heard as music by the characters on stage. But it's not the Don himself that is producing his own accompaniment. Rather, it is provided by a member of the orchestra.
E vieni alla finestra, o mio tesoro, e vieni a consolare il pianto mio.
This is a clever addition to the layers of deception on stage, since Don Giovanni is lying to the audience as much as to Elvira's unsuspecting handmaiden, a scintillatingly clever deception using music to permeate the boundary between opera and audience. I want to leave you with one final musical example to take with you into the theater tonight. Without giving away too much, I don't think that I'm spoiling anything in telling you that by the end of our tale, Don Giovanni's crimes catch up with him with a supernatural vengeance. In the climax of the opera, the Don is famously dragged to hell in a fiery show of spectacle and stagecraft, often involving trapdoors and flashing lights and smoke machines. But what I find so powerful about this scene is the way that the music reinforces the inevitability of this moment. When the ghost of the commendatore that Don Giovanni murdered returns, he is now an angel of death. And as listeners, you can glean this even without subtitled translations, because of the return of the dirge that opened the overture. Even though this moment is marked by a different key, it is immediately recognizable from the ominous opening of the opera. To me, this is a remarkable event because in this moment, the music is no longer just an accompaniment to the action on stage. It becomes almost its own entity, its own character. Some have called it a depiction of fate. Some say that it represents justice, but whatever you feel from the music at this point, it's difficult to deny that it is now the music and not only the actors that is telling the story. These are only a few examples of the power of music in Don Giovanni, but I hope that they give you a good sense of the ingenuity that you can expect to hear tonight. As you go on this journey, maybe for the first time, maybe for the 100th, I challenge you to hear the complexity of Mozart's music. I challenge you to hear the lies in its at times saccharine beauty, the irony in its many layers of musical meaning, the awesomeness of divine retribution in something as mundane as a melody. And I hope that between all of the moments of darkness, you laugh. Thank you.